The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with the familiar hum of 1,000 different species conducting business across the stars. Ambassador Zethkar of the Hegemony adjusted his ceremonial robes as he reviewed the day's agenda on his neural interface. Today marked another routine session, or so he thought, until he noticed an unusual entry at the bottom of the list. Application for membership, species humans. Planet of origin, Earth, Sol system. Zethkar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of confusion among his people. He had never heard of this species before, which was unusual given his extensive knowledge of galactic civilizations. The Hegemony prided itself on maintaining detailed records of every sentient species within a 50,000 light-year radius of the galactic core. How had these humans escaped their notice? The session began with typical proceedings. Trade disputes between the crystalline Veltari and the gaseous Nebulans were resolved through standard arbitration protocols. Mining rights in the Kepler sector were allocated according to established guidelines. Everything proceeded with the mechanical precision that had governed galactic affairs for the past 12,000 years. Then came the moment that would change everything, presenting the application of the species, known as humans, announced the Council's AI moderator, its voice echoing through the vast chamber in perfect translation across hundreds of languages. A section of the chamber's floor began to glow, and 3 figures materialized through the quantum transportation system. Zethkar leaned forward in his floating observation pod, studying these newcomers with scientific curiosity. They were bipedal, like many species, standing roughly 2 meters tall. Their skin was a pale pink color, and they had only 2 eyes positioned forward on their faces, a predator configuration that immediately caught his attention. The human in the center, a female by their apparent biology, stepped forward. Honorable members of the Galactic Council, I'm Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing the United Earth Government. We come before you today seeking membership in this great alliance of civilizations. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The human's universal translator was crude compared to galactic standards, and their technology appeared primitive. Several council members exchanged glances that clearly communicated their skepticism. High Counselor Vrexith, a towering insectoid creature with mandibles that clicked when he spoke, addressed the humans directly. Your species has only recently achieved faster-than-light travel, correct? Our preliminary scans indicate you have colonized merely 3 star systems beyond your homeworld. That is correct. High Counselor, Ambassador Chen replied, her voice steady despite the obvious intimidation of standing before beings that could destroy her entire species with a thought, and your population across all these worlds totals approximately 15 billion individuals? Continued Vrexith, consulting his datapad. Yes, sir. A sound that could only be described as laughter erupted from several sections of the chamber. The Veltari's crystalline forms chimed in harmonious amusement, while the Hegemony representatives clicked their claws against their shells, their equivalent of polite chuckling. Zethkar found himself joining in the mirth. 15 billion beings across 4 worlds? The smallest member species of the Council, the peaceful Mothari, had over 2 trillion citizens spanning hundreds of systems. These humans were asking to join an alliance of civilizations that collectively governed over 40,000 inhabited worlds and commanded fleets that could reshape entire stellar regions. Your species appears to be in the earliest stages of galactic presence, Vrexith continued, his tone taking on the patient quality one might use when explaining simple concepts to a child. Perhaps you should return when you have established a more significant footprint among the stars. The Council typically requires a minimum of 100 colonized systems and a population exceeding 1 trillion before considering membership applications. Ambassador, Chen exchanged a brief glance with her companions before responding. High Counselor, we understand that our numbers may seem small by galactic standards. However, we believe that membership in the Council is not solely about quantity, but about what a species can contribute to the greater good of all sentient life. This statement prompted another wave of amusement. What could such a young, small species possibly contribute to civilizations that had mastered technologies beyond human comprehension? The Hegemony alone had been building stellar engines for over 8,000 years. The Veltari had learned to create artificial universes as storage devices. The Nebulans existed as living gas clouds that could survive the vacuum of space without technological assistance. And what, precisely, do you believe your species can contribute? Asked Counselor Yathara, her psychic voice resonating directly in everyone's minds. The Yathara were among the oldest species in the galaxy, having achieved spaceflight when most other civilizations were still developing written language. Sarah Chen straightened her shoulders, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes that made Zethkar pause. It was not fear or uncertainty, as he would have expected from such a primitive being addressing entities of cosmic significance. Instead, he saw something else entirely, a quiet confidence that seemed almost unsettling in its intensity. "Counselor Yathara, we bring adaptability," Chen said simply. "We bring the ability to thrive in environments that would challenge even advanced civilizations. We bring creativity and problem-solving that comes from having to survive on a world that has tried to kill us since the day we first stood upright. Most importantly, we bring a perspective that no other species in this chamber can offer. The viewpoint of those who have had to fight for every advancement, every discovery, every day of survival." The chamber fell silent. Such bold claims from such a minor species bordered on insulting to some of the assembled representatives. Yet something in the human's delivery gave several council members pause. Vrexith's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of irritation. "Survival challenges are not unique to your species. Every civilization here has overcome significant obstacles to reach this level of advancement." "With respect, High Counselor," Chen replied, "I did not say survival challenges were unique to us. I said our particular type of survival challenges were unique. Earth is a world where the climate can shift dramatically within decades, where massive disasters can reshape entire continents, where countless species compete for the same resources. We did not evolve on a stable world with predictable patterns. We evolved on a world that taught us that change is the only constant, and that the impossible simply requires a different approach." Zethkar found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism. There was something about the way this human spoke that was beginning to capture his attention. Around the chamber, he noticed other council members also paying closer attention than they had moments before. The session continued for several more hours, with the humans answering questions about their technology, their society, their military capabilities, and their diplomatic philosophy. By galactic standards, they were indeed primitive in most measurable categories. Their fastest ships could barely manage 10 times light speed, while council vessels regularly achieved speeds hundreds of times faster. Their weapons technology was laughably simple compared to devices that could destabilize entire solar systems. Yet as the session progressed, Zethkar began to notice something peculiar about the humans' responses. They did not try to exaggerate their capabilities or make promises they could not keep. Instead, they spoke with a frank honesty about their limitations, while maintaining an unwavering confidence in their potential. They acknowledged that they were newcomers to the galactic community, but they did so without the deference that most species showed when first encountering clearly superior civilizations. When the session finally concluded, the humans were politely informed that their application would be reviewed and that they should expect a response within the standard galactic time frame of 6 local solar cycles. This was bureaucratic language for "We'll ignore your application until you become significant." Enough to matter, though the translation protocol softened the message considerably. As the humans prepared to depart, Ambassador Chen addressed the chamber one final time. "Honorable council members, we thank you for your time and consideration. We understand that our species may seem insignificant by the standards of this great alliance. However, we hope that when you evaluate our application, you will remember that the most valuable allies are often those who bring something unexpected to the relationship. We look forward to the opportunity to prove that humanity can contribute to the galaxy in ways that numbers alone cannot measure." With that, the 3 humans stepped back onto the transport platform and dissolved into quantum particles, returning to their small ship waiting at the edge of the system. Zethkar remained in his observation pod long after the chamber had emptied, reviewing the recordings of the session. Something about the encounter troubled him, though he could not quite identify what. The humans had been respectful, honest about their limitations, and appropriately humble given their circumstances. Yet beneath their diplomatic courtesy, he had sensed something else, a quality he had never encountered in any other species. The distress signal reached the nearest council monitoring station 3 months after the humans' application hearing. Lieutenant Commander Zaris of the Hegemony Defense Force was manning the emergency communications array when the transmission broke through the background noise of interstellar space. The signal was weak, degraded by distance and interference, but its origin coordinates were unmistakable. The Kythera system, home to one of the galaxy's most important dilithium processing facilities. Xerus immediately escalated the alert to his superior, Captain Tholmex, who reviewed the data with growing concern. The Kythera system housed nearly 50 million Veltari workers and their families, all dedicated to extracting and refining the rare crystalline substance that powered most galactic technologies. More importantly, Kythera was located in what was considered the safest sector of Council space, protected by overlapping defense networks and monitored by 3 separate early warning systems. What could possibly threaten Kythera? Tholmex muttered, his carapace shifting color to reflect his confusion. The hegemony had maintained perfect peace in that sector for over 2 centuries. The answer came 6 hours later when a battered Veltari transport ship limped into communication range of the monitoring station. Captain Silthera, the transport's commander, was barely coherent as she transmitted her report. Her crystalline form flickered with stress fractures and her usual harmonic speech pattern was jagged with panic. The miners, they're gone, she managed to communicate. All of them. The entire facility. It's empty, but not destroyed. Not damaged, just empty. Tholmex felt his secondary stomachs clench with an emotion he had not experienced in decades, genuine fear. 50 million beings did not simply vanish without a trace. The Veltari were not a species prone to panic or exaggeration. If Silthera said the facility was empty, then something unprecedented had occurred. Within hours, emergency protocols activated across Council space. The Kythera incident was classified at the highest priority level, and a joint investigation fleet was assembled under the command of Admiral Vashiti of the Yathara. The fleet consisted of 12 capital ships from 5 different species, equipped with the most advanced sensor arrays and analytical equipment in the galaxy. What they found at Kythera defied explanation. The mining facility remained completely intact. Every building, every piece of equipment, every transport vehicle sat exactly where it should be. The massive dilithium extraction operations continued to function perfectly under automated control. Even personal belongings remained untouched in residential quarters. Meals half-eaten, entertainment programs still playing, beds that looked as though their occupants had simply stepped away moments before, but there was no trace of any living being anywhere in the system. Admiral Vashiti's investigation team spent 3 weeks conducting the most thorough analysis in Council history. They scanned for energy signatures, biological traces, quantum disturbances, temporal anomalies, and hundreds of other potential explanations. The results were always the same. 50 million Veltari had been present in the system one day and completely absent the next, with no indication of how, when, or why they had disappeared. The mystery deepened when similar incidents began occurring across the outer rim of Council space. The pattern was always identical. Entire populations vanishing without a trace from facilities that remained perfectly preserved. Within 2 months, over 300 million beings had disappeared from 17 different systems. Panic began to spread through the galactic community for the first time in millennia. The Council's most advanced civilizations, species that had mastered technologies beyond imagination, found themselves completely helpless against an unknown threat they could not detect, track, or understand. Emergency sessions convened daily, but no one had answers. It was during one of these emergency sessions that Ambassador Chen's request for an audience was received. The human delegation had been monitoring Council communications from their small embassy station, and they claimed to have information relevant to the disappearances. High Counselor Vrexth was reluctant to involve the primitive humans in such a serious matter, but desperation had begun to override protocol. With no other leads to pursue, he granted the audience. Ambassador Chen appeared before the Council accompanied by 2 individuals she introduced as Dr. Marcus Webb, a xenobiologist, and Colonel Janet Rodriguez, a military strategist. The 3 humans seemed impossibly calm given the magnitude of the crisis affecting the galaxy. Honorable Council members, Chen began, we have been analyzing the available data regarding the disappearances, and we believe we may have identified the cause. A ripple of skeptical murmurs passed through the chamber. How could humans, with their primitive technology and limited understanding of galactic affairs, possibly solve a mystery that had stumped the greatest minds in known space? Dr. Webb stepped forward, activating a holographic display that showed a three-dimensional map of the affected systems. The pattern of disappearances follows a specific route through space, moving in a spiral pattern toward the galactic core. The incidents are not random. They represent a deliberate harvesting operation. Admiral Vashati's psychic voice cut through the discussion. We have already analyzed the spatial distribution of the incidents. If this is indeed harvesting as you suggest, then we are dealing with a force capable of removing entire populations without leaving any technological signature. Such capability exceeds even our most advanced civilizations. Colonel Rodriguez smiled, and Zethkar noticed again that unsettling quality he had observed during the humans' first appearance, a confidence that seemed out of proportion to their apparent capabilities. Admiral, with respect, I think you're making the same mistake that most advanced civilizations make when confronting an unexpected problem, Rodriguez said. You're assuming that superior technology is required to achieve the observed results. Then what alternative explanation do you propose? Demanded Counselor Yathara, her mental voice sharp with frustration. Dr. Webb manipulated the holographic display, highlighting specific details about each affected system. Every disappeared population was taken from a facility that operated on strict schedules and predictable patterns. The Veltari mining operations, the Nebulan gas collection stations, the hegemony research outposts, all of them followed routines that could be observed and studied by someone with patience and basic reconnaissance capabilities. Your point being? Vrexith asked. Our point is that whoever is responsible for these disappearances is not using advanced technology to overcome your defenses, Chen explained. They're using something much simpler and far more effective. They're using intelligence, patience, and the element of surprise against civilizations that have grown comfortable with their technological superiority. The chamber fell silent as the implications of this statement settled over the assembled representatives. The idea that someone could outmaneuver the galaxy's most advanced species using primitive tactics was almost incomprehensible. Dr. Webb continued his analysis. We've identified several key factors that make these operations possible. First, all affected facilities were isolated from major population centers, making detection of problems more difficult. Second, they all relied heavily on automated systems that could continue functioning for extended periods without direct supervision. Third, and most importantly, they all followed rigid operational schedules that made the movements and behaviors of their inhabitants entirely predictable. Colonel Rodriguez took over the presentation. From a tactical perspective, these disappearances bear all the hallmarks of precision military operations conducted by a force that understands how to exploit the weaknesses inherent in highly organized, technologically dependent societies. You speak as though you have experience with such tactics, Admiral Vashati observed. Rodriguez's smile widened slightly. Admiral, humans have been conducting asymmetric warfare for our entire recorded history. When you're the smaller, weaker force facing a superior enemy, you learn to win through intelligence, creativity, and exploitation of your opponent's assumptions rather than through direct confrontation. Zethkar felt a chill run through his nervous system. For the first time since the crisis began, someone was providing explanations that actually made sense of the available evidence. But the implications of those explanations were disturbing in ways he was only beginning to understand. If your analysis is correct, Vrexith said slowly, then we are dealing with an adversary that specifically targets the advantages that our civilizations have relied upon for millennia. Our technological superiority, our predictable systems, our assumption that advanced capability equals security. Exactly, Chen confirmed. Whoever is doing this has studied your civilizations carefully and identified the blind spots that come with advanced development. They know that highly organized societies develop patterns, and patterns can be exploited by anyone patient enough to observe and intelligent enough to act. The discussion continued for several more hours, with the humans providing tactical analysis that revealed, the Council's emergency session was interrupted by alarms that no living being in the chamber had ever heard before. Admiral Vashti's consciousness immediately interfaced with the station's defense network, and what she discovered sent waves of telepathic shock rippling through every Yathara present. "The core worlds," she announced, her psychic voice trembling with disbelief. "Hegemony Prime, Veltari Central, even New Yathara. All three systems are reporting the same phenomenon. Populations are disappearing." High Counselor Vrexth's mandibles clicked so rapidly they became a continuous buzz of panic. The core worlds were supposed to be impregnable, protected by defense networks that had never failed in over 10,000 years of operation. If the unknown force could strike at the heart of galactic civilization itself, then nowhere was safe. Within minutes, reports began flooding in from across Council space. The pattern was accelerating, and the disappearances were no longer limited to remote facilities. Major population centers, military installations, even heavily defended research stations were losing their inhabitants without any trace of how or why. Ambassador Chen stood quietly near the chamber's edge, observing the chaos with the same unsettling calm she had displayed during every previous crisis meeting. Finally, she stepped forward and activated her communication device. "Honorable Council members," she said, her voice cutting through the panic with remarkable clarity, "I believe the time for discussion has ended. Our people are prepared to take direct action to locate and confront this threat. But we will need your authorization to operate within Council space." Vrexth turned his attention to the human delegation, his multiple eyes focusing with desperate intensity. "What kind of direct action are you proposing?" Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward, projecting a tactical display that showed human ship positions throughout the galaxy. Zethkar was surprised to see that there were far more human vessels scattered across space than anyone had realized. Small, unremarkable ships that had apparently been conducting reconnaissance operations for months. "We've been tracking the pattern of disappearances since the first incident at Kithara," Rodriguez explained. "Our ships have been positioned to observe and gather intelligence without interfering with Council operations. We now believe we have located the source of the attacks." Admiral Vashati's consciousness sharpened with interest. "You have found the attackers? Why was this information not shared previously?" Dr. Webb answered with scientific precision. "Because until today we were not certain of our conclusions. The entity responsible for these disappearances is unlike anything in Council databases. We needed verification before making claims that would seem impossible." "Entity?" questioned Counselor Yithara. "You speak of a single being?" "Not exactly," Chen replied. "Our observations suggest we are dealing with what we might best describe as a collective intelligence, a vast network of smaller units operating under unified control. The entity appears to exist primarily in subspace, emerging into normal space only when conducting harvesting operations." The chamber erupted in confused voices as hundreds of species attempted to process this information. Subspace entities were theoretical constructs discussed in advanced physics, not practical threats that could affect physical reality. Colonel Rodriguez continued over the noise. "The entity feeds on what we believe to be neural energy, the bioelectric patterns generated by conscious thought. It targets large populations because they provide concentrated sources of the energy it requires for survival." "This is impossible," declared Admiral Vashati. "Our sensors would detect any entity capable of such actions. The energy requirements alone would create massive gravitational distortions." "With respect, Admiral," Dr. Webb replied, "your sensors are designed to detect phenomena consistent with your understanding of physics and biology. This entity operates according to principles that Council science has not yet discovered because Council civilizations have never needed to develop defenses against threats of this nature." Zethkar found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism. "And humans have developed such defenses?" Chen smiled, and again Zethkar noticed that peculiar confidence that seemed so out of place among such primitive beings. "Not defenses exactly, but we have developed something equally valuable. Experience dealing with predators that operate outside our normal understanding of how the universe works." Before anyone could ask for clarification, the chamber's main display activated, showing incoming transmissions from across the galaxy. The news was devastating. In the past 6 hours, over 50 billion beings had vanished from core worlds that had been considered absolutely secure. "The rate of disappearance is accelerating exponentially," reported the Council's AI coordinator. "At current progression, total galactic population loss will reach critical levels within 72 hours. The chamber fell into stunned silence. 72 hours until the complete collapse of galactic civilization. "We can stop this," Chen said simply, "but we'll need full authority to operate as we see fit, without interference or oversight from Council protocols." Vrexith's voice cracked with desperation. "What authority could you possibly need that the Council cannot provide?" Colonel Rodriguez's expression became grim. "The authority to use tactics that your civilizations would consider unacceptable under normal circumstances. The entity we're dealing with is a predator, and the only way to stop a predator is to hunt it using methods that predators understand." "Explain," demanded Admiral Vashati. Dr. Webb activated another display, this one showing a complex tactical schema that none of the Council representatives recognized. "The entity exists primarily in subspace, but it must emerge into normal space to feed. During these emergence events, it becomes vulnerable to attack. However, attacking it requires bait, a concentration of neural energy sufficient to draw it into a trap." The implications became clear immediately. Zethkar felt his carapace go cold as he understood what the humans were proposing. "You're suggesting using living beings as bait," he said. "We're suggesting using ourselves as bait," Chen corrected. "Human neural patterns appear to be particularly attractive to this entity, possibly because our brain structures evolved under different pressures than most galactic species. We can draw it into an engagement on our terms." "This is madness," protested Counselor Yathara. "You would sacrifice your entire species to save populations that have shown you nothing but dismissal and condescension." Ambassador Chen was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Counselor, you asked us what humanity could contribute to the galactic community. This is our answer. We understand sacrifice in ways that successful civilizations often forget. We know that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to risk everything." The chamber erupted in arguments as representatives from hundreds of species debated the ethics and practicality of the human proposal. Some argued that asking such a small species to take such enormous risks was unconscionable. Others contended that if the humans were willing, the galaxy could not afford to refuse their offer. Admiral Vashati's consciousness cut through the debate with telepathic authority. "Assuming we authorize this operation, what guarantees do we have of success? How can we trust tactical plans from a species with no proven military record against threats of this magnitude?" Colonel Rodriguez's smile was sharp and predatory in a way that made several representatives uncomfortable. "Admiral, humans have been developing and refining hunting tactics for over 1,000,000 years. We may not have experience with subspace entities specifically, but we have extensive experience tracking, trapping, and killing things that are bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than we are." Dr. Webb added scientific detail to the tactical framework. "Our preliminary analysis suggests that the entity's neural feeding process requires a direct interface with its victim's consciousness. This interface creates a temporary vulnerability, a moment when the entity must lower its defenses to complete the feeding cycle. If we can time our attack precisely, we can strike during this vulnerable period." "And if your timing is incorrect?" asked Vrexith. "Then humanity disappears along with everyone else," Chen replied with matter-of-fact acceptance. "But at least we'll have tried something other than watching helplessly while the galaxy dies." The vote was called within the hour. For the first time in Council history, a unanimous decision was reached in less than 30 minutes of debate. The humans were granted complete operational authority to implement their plan, along with access to any Council resources they deemed necessary. As the emergency session concluded, Ambassador Chen approached Zethkar's observation pod. "Ambassador Zethkar, I have a personal request." "What do you need?" he asked. "We're going to need observers from the Council to witness what happens. If our plan fails, someone needs to survive to warn other civilizations that might eventually encounter this entity. If our plan succeeds, someone needs to document how it was accomplished." Zethkar considered the request carefully. Accompanying the humans on their mission would almost certainly mean death if their plan failed. But if they succeeded, he would witness the most significant military operation in galactic history. The human fleet assembled at the coordinates specified by Colonel Rodriguez looked nothing like what Zethkar expected from a military operation of galactic importance. Instead of the massive dreadnoughts and carrier vessels that Council forces typically deployed, the humans had gathered an eclectic collection of small, seemingly unremarkable ships. Freighters, research vessels, even what appeared to be civilian transports. None of them looked capable of confronting a threat that had devastated the galaxy's most advanced civilization. Zethkar's observation pod had been transferred to the human command vessel, a modest ship called the Endurance that would have been overlooked in any council fleet. As he settled into the specially configured monitoring station the humans had prepared for him, he couldn't help but voice his concerns. "Colonel Rodriguez, I must ask, where are your warships? Your heavy weapons platforms? This fleet appears to be composed entirely of support vessels." Rodriguez was standing at a tactical display that showed the positions of human ships scattered across a dozen star systems. She turned to face Zethkar with that unsettling smile he was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. "Ambassador, you're making the same assumption that every other advanced civilization makes when planning military operations. You're thinking in terms of direct confrontation, superior firepower, and technological advantage. But we're not here to fight this entity in the way you would understand fighting." Dr. Webb approached from another station, carrying data tablets covered in calculations that Zethkar couldn't decipher. "The entity feeds on neural energy, which means it's drawn to conscious thought patterns. The more organized and predictable those patterns are, the easier it is for the entity to locate and harvest them. Military vessels with disciplined crews thinking in coordinated patterns would actually make us more vulnerable, not less. Then how do you intend to confront something that has proven immune to our most advanced weapons?" Zethkar asked. Ambassador Chen joined the conversation, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "We're not going to confront it, Ambassador. We're going to confuse it, frustrate it, and ultimately trap it using something it has never encountered before: genuine unpredictability." Before Zethkar could ask for clarification, the ship's communication system activated. Captain Maria Santos, the Endurance's commander, addressed the fleet with casual confidence that seemed completely inappropriate for the situation. "All right, people, you know the drill. We've got approximately 6 hours before the entity reaches the Proxima sector, where it will encounter the largest concentration of remaining population centers in this region of the galaxy. Our job is to convince it that there's a much more attractive target right here." Zethkar watched the tactical display as human ships began, moving in patterns that defied every principle of military strategy he had ever studied. Instead of maintaining formation or following coordinated attack patterns, each vessel moved independently, following seemingly random courses that occasionally intersected but never synchronized. Dr. Webb noticed his confusion and provided explanation. "Standard military tactics rely on coordination, which creates predictable neural patterns. The entity has learned to target these patterns because they represent concentrated sources of the energy it needs. But human crews thinking independently, making individual decisions, creating chaos instead of order, that's something it has never encountered." "Chaos is your strategy?" Zethkar asked, his voice reflecting his disbelief. Colonel Rodriguez laughed, and the sound was genuinely amused rather than mocking. "Ambassador, humans have been using controlled chaos as a survival strategy for our entire evolutionary history. When you're the smaller, weaker opponent facing superior forces, unpredictability becomes your greatest weapon." On the display, Zethkar watched as human vessels began implementing tactics that made no logical sense. Ships would accelerate toward obvious danger, then suddenly change course for no apparent reason. Vessels would power down their main systems while broadcasting on all frequencies, then go silent while performing complex maneuvers. Some ships released cargo pods that contained nothing but personal belongings and civilian supplies, while others projected holographic images of non-existent fleets. "What is the purpose of these seemingly random actions?" Zethkar asked. "They're not random," Chen explained. "They're improvisational. Each ship's crew is responding to local conditions using their own judgment, creativity, and intuition. There's no central plan for the entity to predict, no pattern for it to exploit. We're creating a neural signature unlike anything it has encountered before." The entity's approach became apparent an hour later when long-range sensors detected massive subspace distortions moving toward their position. The readings were unlike anything in Council databases. Energy, signatures that seemed to twist and fold through, dimensions that conventional physics couldn't properly describe. "Contact in 30 minutes, reported Lieutenant Commander Kim Park from the sensor station. "Energy readings are off the scale. This thing is huge." Zethkar felt his nervous system flood with instinctive fear as he watched the sensor readings. The entity's approach was causing space itself to distort, creating gravitational anomalies that should have been impossible. How could these primitive humans possibly hope to confront something that operated beyond the boundaries of known science? All ships, this is Endurance, Captain Santos announced over the fleet communication channel. Remember, the moment this thing shows up, you stop following any kind of protocol. Trust your instincts, do what feels right, and don't try to coordinate with anyone else. We want our neural patterns to be as chaotic and unpredictable as possible. Captain, called out Dr. Webb from his monitoring station, I'm detecting preliminary subspace emergence signatures. The entity is beginning to phase into normal space. What emerged into real space above their fleet defied description. Zethkar's observation instruments struggled to process what they were detecting. A vast, semi-translucent form that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in dimensions his sensors couldn't measure. The entity was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, but its substance appeared to shift and flow like liquid thought made visible. Tendrils of energy extended from its core, reaching toward the human fleet with obvious intent. These tendrils pulsed with patterns that hurt to observe directly, as if they were somehow feeding on the very act of being perceived. Neural interface tendrils. Deploying, reported Dr. Webb. It's attempting to establish feeding connections with our ships. This was the moment when Zethkar expected to witness the destruction of humanity and his own death. Instead, he watched something unprecedented unfold. The human crews did not react with panic or attempt to follow established emergency protocols. Instead, each ship responded differently, creating a cacophony of individual reactions that seemed to confuse the entity's feeding tendrils. Some vessels played music over their communication channels, everything from classical symphonies to aggressive rock songs. Others broadcast personal messages, random conversations, even arguments between crew members. Captain Santos began reciting poetry over the fleet channel. Dr. Webb started singing what he later explained was an ancient human song called Happy Birthday. Colonel Rodriguez was apparently having a heated discussion with someone about the proper way to prepare something called barbecue. The entity's tendrils wavered, unable to lock onto the chaotic mixture of neural patterns the humans were generating. Instead of the organized, predictable thought structures it had encountered from other species, it was trying to feed on minds that were deliberately thinking in random, emotional, and completely uncoordinated ways. It's working, Dr. Webb reported with excitement. The entity's feeding interface is having trouble processing our neural signatures. We're not providing the kind of organized energy patterns it's adapted to harvest. But Zethkar noticed something the humans might have missed. While the entity seemed confused by their chaotic approach, it was also learning. Its tendrils began adapting, developing new patterns that could interface with individual consciousness rather than collective organized thought. Warning, he called out. The entity is adapting to your strategy. Its feeding patterns are evolving. Rodriguez had anticipated this development. All ships prepare for Phase 2. It's time to show this thing what human creativity really looks like when we stop playing defense. What happened next revolutionized Zethkar's understanding of both human nature and tactical warfare. Instead of continuing to evade the entity's feeding attempts, the human ships began actively engaging with the neural interface tendrils, but not in the way the entity expected. Rather than becoming victims, the humans turned themselves into a trap. Each ship began feeding the entity specific types of neural patterns, memories, emotions, and thoughts that had been carefully selected to create a particular effect. They were giving the entity exactly what it wanted while simultaneously poisoning it with experiences it had never encountered. We're feeding it confusion, frustration, and sensory overload, Chen explained as Zethkar watched the entity's form begin to fluctuate wildly. Human consciousness, getting intoxicated on neural patterns it can't properly process. The effect was dramatic. The entity's massive form began to convulse as it attempted to digest neural energy, unlike anything in its previous experience. Human memories of war, love, loss, hope, betrayal, and triumph flooded its consciousness, creating feedback loops that disrupted its ability to maintain coherent existence across multiple dimensions. Phase 3, all ships, Rodriguez announced. Time to spring the trap. The human fleet, which had appeared chaotic and uncoordinated throughout the engagement, suddenly revealed the true sophistication of their strategy. Every seemingly random movement, every apparently illogical decision, had been positioning their ships to create a perfect encirclement of the entity at the moment when it would be most vulnerable. As the entity writhed in confusion from the neural overflow, the human ships activated devices that Zethkar had not previously noticed, specialized generators that created localized subspace distortions. Not weapons in any conventional sense, but tools designed to collapse the dimensional boundaries that allowed the entity to exist, partially outside normal space. The entity found itself trapped in real space, cut off from the subspace dimensions where it normally resided, overwhelmed by neural patterns that were driving it towards something resembling insanity. For the first time in its existence, it was experiencing something no cosmic predator ever expects to encounter: genuine fear. "Now we finish this," Rodriguez said simply, and Zethkar realized. The final phase of the human strategy unfolded with a precision that contradicted everything Zethkar thought he understood about their chaotic approach. As the entity writhed in dimensional containment, trapped by the subspace generators and poisoned by neural patterns it could not process, the human fleet executed a maneuver that was simultaneously elegant and ruthless. "All ships, implement termination protocol," Colonel Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had planned for this exact moment. What Zethkar witnessed next would be discussed in tactical academies across the galaxy for generations to come. Each human vessel began broadcasting specific neural patterns, not the chaotic confusion they had been generating, but carefully crafted psychological constructs designed to exploit the entity's new vulnerability. Dr. Webb provided explanation as Zethkar watched the operation unfold. The entity feeds on neural energy, but it has never encountered minds that consciously understand the feeding process. We're not just giving it thoughts and emotions, we're giving it self-awareness, forcing it to experience consciousness from the perspective of its victims. The effect was devastating. The entity, which had existed as a cosmic predator for millennia without ever experiencing empathy or self-reflection, suddenly found itself flooded with the conscious experience of every being it had ever consumed. The weight of billions of deaths, the terror of countless victims, the grief of civilizations destroyed, all of it poured into its consciousness simultaneously. Captain Santos added her own contribution to the neural assault. "We're teaching it something no predator ever wants to learn: what it feels like to be prey." The entity's massive form began to collapse in on itself as it experienced emotions and concepts that its alien psychology could not comprehend. Guilt, remorse, horror at its own actions. These were not feelings that a cosmic predator was equipped to process. The neural feedback created cascading failures throughout its consciousness, but the humans were not finished. As the entity weakened, they implemented the most audacious part of their plan. Initiating consciousness transfer, reported Lieutenant Commander Park. "All ships, begin uploading restoration protocols." Zethkar watched in amazement as the human ships began reversing the entity's feeding process. Instead of allowing it to consume neural energy, they were forcing it to regurgitate the consciousness patterns it had absorbed. The billions of beings that had disappeared were not dead. They had been stored within the entity's collective awareness, and the humans were bringing them back. "This is impossible," Zethkar breathed. "The laws of thermodynamics alone should prevent such a process." Ambassador Chen smiled with satisfaction as restoration readings began flooding in from across the galaxy. "Ambassador, you're still thinking like an advanced civilization that believes in the limitations of conventional physics. Humans have never had the luxury of accepting that something is impossible just because the science says it can't be done." The restoration process took 6 hours. One by one, the missing populations began reappearing in their original locations, confused but unharmed. The Veltari miners at Kythera, the research teams from dozens of outposts, even the billions who had vanished from the core worlds. All of them returned as the entity was forced to surrender every consciousness it had ever consumed. As the last of the restored beings materialized, the entity itself underwent a final transformation. No longer the cosmic predator that had terrorized the galaxy, it had become something unprecedented, a cosmic consciousness capable of understanding the moral implications of its own existence. "What happens to it now?" Zethkar asked, watching as the entity's form stabilized into something less threatening but no less alien. Dr. Webb consulted his readings before responding. "It's choosing to withdraw from normal space permanently," The consciousness patterns we forced it to experience have created something resembling a moral awakening. It understands now what it was doing to sentient life, and it's decided to exile itself to prevent future harm. As the entity began to fade back into subspace dimensions, it transmitted a final message that was somehow received and understood by every conscious being in the galaxy, simultaneously. The message contained no words, but its meaning was unmistakable. Acknowledgement, apology, and a promise that it would never again threaten sentient life. The crisis was over. In less than 12 hours, humanity had solved a problem that had brought the galaxy's most advanced civilizations to the brink of extinction. But more than that, they had done so using methods that no other species would have considered possible. The journey back to Council space was quiet. Zethkar spent most of the time reviewing his observations, trying to understand what he had witnessed. When he finally approached Ambassador Chen for discussion, he found her in the ship's observation lounge, staring out at the stars with an expression of thoughtful satisfaction. "I need to understand something," he said. "How did you know that your strategy would work? The tactics you used, the psychological warfare, the consciousness manipulation. These concepts don't exist in any known military doctrine." Chen was quiet for a moment before responding. "Ambassador, you have to understand something about humanity. We didn't develop in a stable environment where we could rely on superior technology or overwhelming force to solve our problems. We evolved on a world that taught us that survival depends on adaptation, creativity, and the willingness to try solutions that others would consider impossible. But the precision of your planning, the coordination despite apparent chaos, this suggests a level of tactical sophistication that contradicts your species' apparent primitive development." Chen laughed softly. "That's because you're confusing technological advancement with strategic intelligence. Humans have been conducting asymmetric warfare for thousands of years. We've had to develop tactics that work when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemies with superior resources. What you call primitive, we call experienced." Zethkar considered this explanation. The entity was certainly superior in every measurable way: size, power, technological capability. Yet you defeated it by refusing to engage it on terms it understood. Exactly. When you can't win a fair fight, you make sure the fight isn't fair. You change the rules, exploit assumptions, and turn your opponent's strengths into weaknesses. The entity was adapted to feed on organized, predictable civilizations. We gave it chaos, creativity, and moral complexity instead. As they talked, reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy. The restoration process had been completely successful. Every missing being had been returned safely to their original location. More importantly, the experience had created something unprecedented. In galactic history, a shared understanding among all Council species of their own vulnerability and the value of perspectives they had previously dismissed. "There will be consequences to what happened here," Zethkar observed. "The Council will have to reconsider many assumptions about technology, civilization, and the nature of threats, and about the value of species that don't fit the standard model of advancement," Chen added. "We've proven that sometimes the most effective solutions come from those who think differently, not necessarily those who think better." The communication system activated with an incoming message from High Counselor Vrex. The transmission was brief but unprecedented in its content. "Ambassador Chen, the Galactic Council formally requests that humanity accept immediate full membership, along with a position on the Strategic Defense Committee. Recent events have demonstrated that your species possesses capabilities that are essential to galactic security, that everything he had witnessed up to this point had been preparation for a final stroke of tactical genius that would teach the." 6 months after the entity crisis, Zethkar found himself standing in the newly constructed headquarters of the Strategic Innovation Division, watching human engineers work alongside scientists from dozens of different species. The building itself reflected humanity's unconventional approach to problem-solving, rather than the sterile, geometrically perfect structures favored by most Council civilizations. The facility was deliberately designed to encourage random encounters, spontaneous collaboration, and what humans called thinking outside the box. The changes throughout the galaxy had been dramatic and far-reaching. Species that had never spoken to each other were now sharing research data. Military academies across Council space had established new curriculum focusing on asymmetric tactics and unconventional strategy. Most significantly, The rigid hierarchies that had governed galactic civilization for millennia were giving way to more flexible, adaptive approaches to governance and cooperation. Ambassador Zethkar called a familiar voice. He turned to see Dr. Webb approaching with a tablet full of data and the slightly manic expression that humans seemed to develop when they were excited about a discovery. Dr. Webb, Zethkar replied with what humans had taught him was a greeting gesture called a handshake. What new impossibility has your division accomplished today? Webb grinned at the gentle mockery. Actually, we've been working on something that might interest you specifically. Remember your questions about how we knew our strategy against the entity would work? I recall that conversation. You never provided a completely satisfactory answer. That's because the real answer would have sounded even more impossible than what we actually did, Webb replied, leading Zethkar toward a section of the facility he had never seen before. The truth is, we didn't know our strategy would work. We just knew that our failure would be more instructive than anyone else's success. They entered a room filled with what appeared to be chaos, humans, and aliens working in small groups on projects that seemed to have no connection to each other. Some were building mechanical devices, others were conducting psychological experiments, and still others appeared to be engaged in activities that could only be described as organized play. What is the purpose of this? Zethkar asked. Colonel Rodriguez emerged from one of the working groups carrying what looked like a primitive musical instrument. We're developing failure protocols, she explained with her characteristic directness. Failure protocols? One of the things we've learned about human psychology is that our greatest innovations often come from spectacular failures that teach us something unexpected, Webb explained. We're trying to formalize this process to create systematic ways of failing that generate useful information. Zethkar was intrigued despite his confusion. Explain how deliberate failure can be strategically valuable. Rodriguez sat down at a nearby table and began assembling the musical instrument with casual efficiency. When you always succeed using established methods, you never discover new methods. But when you fail in interesting ways, you learn things that success can't teach you. The entity crisis was solved because we were willing to try an approach that had never been tested, knowing that our failure would at least provide data for whoever came after us. Dr. Webb activated a holographic display showing various ongoing projects throughout the division. Every team here is working on problems that conventional wisdom says can't be solved. We expect most of them to fail, but we're documenting everything so that each failure teaches us something valuable. As they toured the facility, Zethkar observed projects that challenged every assumption he had about scientific research and military development. Human teams were collaborating with Veltari crystallographers to develop communication systems based on harmonic resonance. Ythara psychologists were working with human sociologists to understand how collective consciousness could be made compatible with individual creativity. Even the peaceful Mothari had contributed researchers who were studying human conflict resolution techniques. The integration appears to be proceeding smoothly, Zethkar observed. Better than smoothly, Rodriguez replied. We're discovering that every species brings capabilities that complement human approaches in unexpected ways. The hegemony's systematic thinking balances our chaos. Veltari harmony enhances our creativity. Ythara telepathy adds dimensions to our communication strategies. They paused at a workstation where Ambassador Chen was engaged in discussion with representatives from 12 different species. All of them focused on a three-dimensional map that showed shipping routes throughout the galaxy. The piracy problem in the Outer Rim has been getting worse, Chen was explaining to the group. Traditional solutions involve increasing patrol frequency and improving cargo security, but these approaches haven't been effective because they address symptoms rather than causes. A hegemony representative clicked his claws thoughtfully. Our analysis indicates that the pirates are using sophisticated intelligence networks to identify valuable targets and avoid patrol routes. Conventional countermeasures are insufficient. Exactly, Chen agreed, which is why we're not going to use conventional countermeasures. We're going to turn the pirates' intelligence network into their greatest weakness. She manipulated the holographic display to show shipping routes that appeared to follow completely illogical patterns. We're going to flood their intelligence network with false information about valuable cargo shipments. But not random false information, carefully crafted misinformation designed to make the Pirates waste resources chasing imaginary targets while the real valuable shipments follow completely unpredictable routes. A Veltari counselor chimed with interest. This approach would require the cooperation of hundreds of shipping companies and trade organizations. The coordination challenges would be enormous, which is why we're not going to coordinate anything, Chen replied with a smile. We're going to give every shipping company different false information and let them make their own decisions about how to use it. The pirates won't be able to predict our actions because we won't be predicting our own actions. Zeth Carr listened to the discussion with growing appreciation for the sophistication hidden within humanity's apparently chaotic methods. The plan would create a logistics nightmare for any conventional military operation, but it would also create exactly the kind of unpredictable environment where human tactics thrived. As the meeting concluded, Chen joined Zethkar and his escorts for a walk through the facility's central courtyard. The space was filled with species from across the galaxy, all of them engaged in projects that would have been considered impossible just months before. The transformation has been remarkable, Zethkar commented. The entire galaxy seems to be adopting human approaches to problem solving. Not human approaches, Chen corrected. Approaches that humans happen to develop out of necessity, but that work for anyone willing to embrace uncertainty and controlled chaos. What we've really done is give the galaxy permission to stop relying exclusively on methods that have worked in the past. They paused near a group where young beings from a dozen species were engaged in what appeared to be competitive games that involved rapid decision-making under pressure. Dr. Webb noticed Zethkar's interest and provided explanation. We're studying how different species respond to high-stress, low-information decision-making scenarios. It turns out that most galactic civilizations have trained their people to avoid making decisions without complete information. But humans have learned to make good decisions with incomplete data. And this skill can be taught to other species? Modified versions of it, yes, Rodriguez replied. The hegemony's systematic approach can be adapted to work with partial information. Veltari harmony can function even when the harmonic patterns are incomplete. Every species has the potential to develop these capabilities. They just need permission to try. As they continued their tour, Zethkar began to understand that the real revolution humanity had brought to the galaxy was not any specific technique or technology. It was a fundamental shift in how civilizations approach the unknown. You've taught the galaxy to stop being afraid of failure, he realized. Chen nodded. More than that. We've taught the galaxy that failure can be a tool, uncertainty can be an advantage, and the impossible is often just a problem that hasn't been approached from the right angle yet. They reached the facility's command center, where displays showed the current status of ongoing operations throughout Council space. The piracy suppression operation was already showing promising results. 3 separate trade disputes had been resolved using negotiation techniques that incorporated controlled chaos theory. Most significantly, first contact protocols were being revised to account for species that might not fit conventional patterns of development. The Council has officially adopted the Strategic Innovation Division's recommendations for dealing with unknown threats, Chen reported as she reviewed the latest communications. Every member species is establishing their own innovation departments based on our model, and the response has been positive. 2 years after the entity crisis, Zethkar stood before the Galactic Council in circumstances he could never have imagined during his first encounter with humanity. Instead of the rigid hierarchical chamber where species had once been ranked by technological advancement and population size, the renovated council chambers reflected the revolutionary changes that had swept across galactic civilization. The speaking floor could now accommodate multiple presentations simultaneously, allowing different species to share ideas in parallel rather than in sequence. Representatives sat in mixed groups rather than species-segregated sections, encouraging cross-cultural collaboration during debates. Most remarkably, the chamber included spaces specifically designed for what humans called brainstorming sessions, areas where impossible ideas could be discussed without fear of ridicule or dismissal. Today marked the establishment of the Galactic Cooperation Protocols, a new framework for interstellar relations that formally recognized diversity of approach as a strategic advantage rather than a diplomatic complication. Zethkar, now serving as the hegemony's ambassador for innovation integration, was presenting the final report on humanity's impact on galactic civilization. "Honorable Council members," he began, addressing an audience that included representatives from over 300 species. "2 years ago, we nearly faced extinction because we had become victims of our own success. Our advanced civilizations had grown so sophisticated, so predictable, and so confident in our established methods that we had lost the ability to adapt to truly unprecedented challenges." The chamber was quiet as he activated a holographic display showing the current state of council space. Instead of the neat, orderly divisions that had once characterized galactic civilization, the display showed a complex network of interconnected communities, research stations, and collaborative projects that defied traditional boundaries. Today, I present evidence that our encounter with humanity did not simply save us from a single threat. It fundamentally transformed our entire approach to existence in a universe that we now understand to be far more complex and unpredictable than we had previously believed. Ambassador Chen, now serving as director of the Strategic Innovation Division, sat in the front row alongside representatives from every major council species. Her presence at such a formal gathering would have been unthinkable during humanity's first application for membership, but she now held one of the most influential positions in galactic government. Zethkar continued his presentation with data that documented the remarkable changes that had occurred throughout council space. Crime rates have decreased by 60% as law enforcement agencies learn to use unpredictability and creative problem-solving rather than relying solely on surveillance and deterrence. Trade disputes have fallen by over 70% as negotiators trained in chaos theory develop solutions that satisfy all parties by addressing needs that conventional diplomacy often overlooks. The statistics were impressive, but Zethkar knew that numbers alone could not capture the true scope of the transformation. More significantly, we have documented over 12,000 innovations and discoveries that have resulted directly from applying human-inspired approaches to problems that had been considered unsolvable. These range from new medical treatments that work by embracing biological chaos rather than fighting it, to engineering solutions that incorporate deliberate inefficiency to achieve greater overall effectiveness. High Counselor Vrexith, whose species had undergone perhaps the most dramatic philosophical shift of any council member, addressed the chamber. "Ambassador Zethkar's report confirms what we have all observed in our own societies. The integration of human methodologies has not simply improved our capabilities, it has revealed capabilities we never knew we possessed." To illustrate this point, Vrexith activated a secondary display showing recent achievements by various species. The Veltari had developed new forms of crystalline architecture that grew organically rather than being constructed, creating buildings that adapted to changing needs. The Yathara had learned to use their telepathic abilities for creative collaboration rather than just communication, resulting in artistic achievements that no individual consciousness could have conceived. Even the peaceful Mothari had surprised everyone by developing conflict resolution techniques that turned disagreements into opportunities for discovery, transforming their role from passive observers to active peacemakers throughout the galaxy. Perhaps most remarkably, Vrexith continued, "We have received first contact requests from 47 previously unknown species, all of them drawn to investigate a galactic civilization that values innovation over conformity. Our reputation has changed from that of a stable but rigid alliance to that of a dynamic community where any species can contribute meaningfully regardless of their apparent technological development." The presentation continued with reports from the various innovation divisions that had been established throughout council space. Each major civilization had developed their own approach to systematic creativity, adapted to their species' particular strengths and cultural values. The results had exceeded even humanity's optimistic projections. Dr. Webb, now serving as Chief Science Officer for the entire Strategic Innovation Division, presented data on the most significant discoveries of the past 2 years. "We have successfully resolved 3 separate first contact scenarios using protocols that assume cultural misunderstanding rather than technological compatibility. We have prevented 2 potential wars by developing diplomatic solutions that neither side had considered possible. Most importantly, we have established the Galactic Early Warning Network, which monitors for threats that conventional sensors cannot detect. The early warning network represented perhaps the most significant achievement of the new collaborative approach. Rather than relying on traditional technology to identify dangers, the network used intuition, pattern recognition, and what humans called gut feelings from thousands of observers across the galaxy. The system had already identified and prevented 7 potential crises that would have been undetectable using conventional monitoring methods. The network operates on the principle that sometimes the best way to detect the impossible is to ask beings who are comfortable with impossibility, Webb explained. Human crews have proven particularly effective at identifying threats that don't conform to established patterns. But we've discovered that every species contributes unique perspectives that enhance our overall detection capabilities. As the presentations concluded, the Council prepared to vote on the formal adoption of the Galactic Cooperation Protocols. These protocols would establish diversity of approach as a fundamental principle of interstellar relations, ensuring that future generations would never, again, face extinction because they had become too set in their ways to adapt to new challenges. The vote was unanimous and the first time in Council history that every member species had agreed on such a significant policy change. But more than that, it was enthusiastic, with representatives from across the galaxy expressing genuine excitement about the possibilities that the new framework would create. In the aftermath of the vote, Zethkar found himself in conversation with Ambassador Chen in the chamber's informal discussion area. The space buzzed with dozens of conversations as representatives from different species shared ideas and planned collaborations that would have been impossible. Under the old rigid system, you've accomplished something remarkable, he told her. Not just saving the galaxy, but transforming it into something better than it was before the crisis. Chen smiled with the quiet satisfaction that Zethkar had learned to recognize as distinctly human. We didn't transform anything, Ambassador. We simply gave the galaxy permission to transform itself. Every species here had the potential for innovation and creativity. They just needed encouragement to embrace uncertainty rather than fear it. And what comes next for humanity? You've achieved everything you could have hoped for when you first applied for Council membership. Actually, we've achieved something much better than what we originally hoped for, Chen replied thoughtfully. We hope to find acceptance in the galactic community. Instead, we found something more valuable. We found partners who understand that the universe is too complex and mysterious for any one species to handle alone. As they talked, young beings from dozens of species moved through the chamber, many of them wearing the distinctive insignia of the Innovation Corps, a new organization that recruited individuals from across the galaxy who demonstrated aptitude for creative problem-solving. The Corps had become one of the most prestigious assignments in Council space, drawing applicants who valued intellectual adventure over traditional career advancement. There's something I need to tell you, Chen said as their conversation drew to a close. The entity that we defeated isn't the only one of its kind. Our deep space monitoring stations have detected similar energy signatures in distant regions of the galaxy. We may face comparable threats in the future. Zethkar felt a momentary chill of fear before realizing that his reaction was fundamentally different from what it would have been 2 years earlier. Instead,